Wes Craven's home in Los Angeles carried an aura even while he was alive, not only because he was the master of horror, but because the house itself seemed like a setting from one of his films. It was a large, somewhat secluded property with ivy climbing across old stone walls, tall narrow windows that always seemed to catch shadows in their glass, and long hallways that echoed footsteps louder than expected. After his passing, the house went on the market quietly, and eventually it was purchased by a younger couple, Daniel and Claire Monroe, who had recently moved from New York in hopes of starting over in California. At first, they were thrilled. The idea of living in Wes Craven's home felt almost like owning a piece of Hollywood history. Friends teased them about whether the place was haunted, and Daniel brushed it off with a smile. But soon after moving in, the couple noticed unsettling details. The light in the upstairs corridor would flicker only at night, and no electrician could find a wiring problem. The master bedroom door sometimes refused to stay open, slowly closing itself as if pushed by a heavy hand. Claire, who worked from home, felt the house more intimately. She claimed the layout of the upstairs seemed to shift in subtle ways. Hallways felt longer some days, and one of the smaller guest rooms had an unshakable draft that carried the faint smell of cigarette smoke, even though neither of them smoked. On one occasion, while unpacking boxes in the study, she discovered a built-in drawer stuck behind a bookcase. Inside were fragments of old Polaroid photographs, showing sets, blood props, and crew members she assumed were from Wes's earlier projects. But one photo disturbed her deeply. It was of the very study she was sitting in, from decades earlier, with a blurred figure in the corner of the frame, facing the wall. Daniel dismissed it as just odd memorabilia, but things escalated. At night, both of them began to hear what they described as drafts of whispers traveling down the stairwell. Sometimes it sounded like dialogue being rehearsed, sometimes just broken words, always hushed. Claire swore she once heard her own name among them. The neighbors, when asked, admitted that no one ever stayed in the house long after Wes's passing. Renters came and went, buyers backed out before closing. Some locals believed it wasn't the house that was haunted but the stories Wes had written within it, that the boundary between his imagination and the walls around him had blurred over time. For the Monroes, that explanation felt less like folklore and more like reality with each passing month. Daniel began spending more time outside the house, almost unconsciously, as if the walls themselves made his chest feel heavy. He would linger in the driveway after work, scrolling his phone, listening to the evening traffic on Mulholland, delaying the moment he'd step through the front door. Claire noticed, though she said nothing at first. She was already overwhelmed by what she was experiencing while alone in the house, the strange shifts in light, the feeling that the mirrors held more depth than they should, as though their reflections waited just a second too long before copying her movements. The house had a way of keeping its presence quiet until the couple was still. At night, once they had turned off the television and the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, a pressure would rise through the floors. It wasn't the groaning of old wood, not the natural sighs of a settling house. It was deliberate. The silence felt occupied, as if someone else had drawn up a chair at the table, unseen, uninvited. Claire tried to keep her routine, mornings at her desk in the study, afternoons in the kitchen. Yet, every day she found herself avoiding certain corners. The guest room with the draft became impossible to enter. She began closing it off completely, taping the door shut as if that flimsy barrier could keep something in. The study, once her favorite spot, was now a place she entered only with the curtains drawn. She couldn't look at the photograph she had found, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away either. It lay in a drawer, face down, but she swore she could feel it even when she sat across the room, a cold prickle, like eyes on her back. Daniel, increasingly restless, invited a few friends over one Saturday evening. He thought filling the house with laughter and chatter would drown out whatever unease they'd built up in their heads. But as the night wore on, Claire caught their guests glancing at the ceiling, then toward the shadowed hall. One of Daniel's old college buddies asked half-jokingly if Wes had left behind a recording studio because he kept hearing voices through the floorboards. No one stayed past midnight. When the front door shut behind the last guest, the house seemed to inhale deeply, as if reclaiming its space. Weeks passed, and the couple began speaking less about what they noticed, afraid that acknowledging it made it stronger. But the house refused silence. Claire would sometimes wake to the sound of footsteps pacing just beyond their bedroom door, slow, measured, as though waiting for the courage to enter. Daniel, half asleep, always dismissed it as dreams. But the next morning, the carpet outside their room carried faint impressions, not full footprints, but distortions in the fibers, as if weight had pressed down and then vanished. Then came the incident in the kitchen. Claire was preparing dinner, the knife steady in her hand, when the overhead light flickered and cut out completely. She froze, gripping the counter in the darkness. From the other side of the room came a soft scrape like a chair moving across tile. But when Daniel came rushing in with a flashlight, everything was perfectly in place. Except the knife. She didn't drop it. She was certain of that. Yet when Daniel shone the light, it lay neatly on the far side of the table, blade pointing toward her. By now, their conversations had shifted from whether the house was haunted to what they should do about it. Daniel insisted it was still their home, still a valuable property. Claire, pale from sleepless nights, was less certain. "It doesn't want us here," she whispered one morning, her eyes fixed on the empty hallway as if she expected someone to appear. The walls of Wes Craven's house seemed to listen. And every night, when the lights dimmed and the city beyond the hills quieted, the whispers returned clearer now. Not just broken words but fragmented lines, like dialogue ripped from a script. They came from the walls, the vents, sometimes from the darkened television screen. Lines that spoke of fear, of doors that would not open, of people who could not escape. Claire began to recognize them. They weren't random. They were lines from Wes's films. The realization struck Claire gradually, over the course of several nights. At first, she thought it was her memory filling in the blanks of the whispers. She had grown up watching Wes Craven's movies, after all, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, the films that defined the genre. But as she lay awake in the dark, listening, she began to hear exact fragments, unmistakable lines, recited in broken tones as if rehearsed by unseen mouths. "Whatever you do, don't fall asleep. We all go a little mad sometimes. Do you like scary movies?" The voices came in low murmurs, overlapping, and what unsettled her most was that some were distorted, half-garbled, not matching any human inflection she'd ever heard. It was as though the house itself was trying to speak, cobbling together words it had absorbed over decades. She didn't tell Daniel right away. Instead, she tested it. One night, she sat alone in the living room with the lights off, recording on her phone as the whispers stirred again. When she played it back in the morning, the file was blank, nothing but a faint hiss, the sound of static. No voices, no words. Yet as the phone lay in her hand, she swore she could still hear faint laughter rising from the speakers, as if the device had captured something she couldn't replay. Daniel noticed the change in her. She had grown distant, always tired, staring off at corners of the room where nothing stood. He told her she was letting her imagination take over. But then, one night, it was his turn. He had woken past midnight, thirsty, and wandered down the long hall toward the kitchen. The light above the stairwell buzzed faintly, throwing weak illumination across the landing. That's when he saw it, a figure leaning just beyond the banister. Not fully formed, not solid, but a presence nonetheless. The outline was human, tall and narrow, with a slight tilt of the head, as though watching him. For a long second he froze, breath caught in his throat, before fumbling for the switch. The light above the landing snapped bright, and the figure dissolved, leaving only the silence of the stairwell. Daniel returned to the bedroom shaken, face pale. For the first time, he didn't argue when Claire whispered, "You saw it, didn't you?" Days blurred into weeks. The Monroes stopped inviting anyone over, embarrassed by how jittery they had become. They no longer ate in the dining room, where the chandelier rattled softly even with the windows closed. The guest room door remained sealed, untouched, though sometimes, late at night, they heard a faint tapping from inside, a steady, patient rhythm, like fingernails against wood. Claire started keeping notes, a sort of journal, logging every sound, every flicker, every strange shift in the atmosphere. She thought maybe documenting it would bring control, some sense of order. But instead, the entries began to frighten her. Patterns emerged. The noises often came at the same times each night. The whispers grew clearer when storms rolled across the hills, and the drafts seemed to emanate not from windows or vents but from the walls themselves. Most disturbing of all was the way the house began to direct their movements. A drawer left open in the kitchen would cause her to trip, nearly sending the contents crashing to the floor. A door would swing shut just as Daniel reached for the knob, forcing him down another hall. Lights went out selectively always when they were headed toward the study, never when they remained in the living room. It was as though the house had preferences, guiding them toward some unseen design. One morning, Claire opened the curtains in the study only to find the photograph she had hidden away resting on the windowsill. The same photograph with the blurred figure in the corner. She hadn't touched it in weeks, and the drawer she had left it in was still closed. She stared at it, her hand trembling as she reached for the edge of the frame. The light through the window caught the glossy surface, and for the briefest moment she thought the blurred figure had shifted, not facing the wall anymore, but facing her. She dropped the photo and backed away, her breath sharp and shallow. From the hall, Daniel's voice called out, asking if she was okay. But his voice seemed too far, too muffled, as if he weren't in the house at all. That night, neither of them slept. The whispers had grown bold, swelling in volume until the words were almost clear sentences. The voices did not come from above or below anymore, they came from every wall, surrounding them, closing in like an audience waiting for the final act. And the Monroes began to understand. This was not just a house where Wes Craven had lived. It was a house where his creations had taken root, where his nightmares had seeped into the foundation, where fiction had been rehearsed and replayed until it had nowhere else to go but into the walls themselves. They had stepped into a stage that never ended, and the house was waiting for them to play their part. The following weeks pressed down on the Monroes like a tightening noose. The house had stopped pretending to be subtle. Doors no longer creaked, they slammed. Lights didn't flicker, they burst, leaving behind the acrid smell of burnt filament. The sound of pacing in the halls grew heavier, no longer confined to whispers or drafts, but carrying the unmistakable weight of footsteps that pressed into the floorboards. Daniel tried to convince himself it was stress, that their nerves were wearing thin, but his hands betrayed him. They shook when he reached for his keys in the morning, when he locked up at night. He had started leaving the TV on while he worked in his home office, thinking the constant chatter would drown out anything else. But some evenings, the screen seemed to betray him. Flashes of static would bloom, interrupting the program, and in the hiss of white noise he swore he heard voices calling his name. Claire had it worse. She was in the house longer, more exposed to its moods. The study, the one room she'd once cherished, had become unbearable. She avoided it entirely, but the house punished her for neglecting it. Doors jammed when she tried to leave other rooms, as though funneling her toward that one space. She resisted, but one afternoon, after the kitchen door refused to budge no matter how hard she pulled, she turned and saw that the study door had opened by itself, yawning dark, waiting. When Daniel came home that evening, he found her inside, sitting in the middle of the room with the photograph clutched in her hands. She didn't look up when he called her name. Her eyes were fixed on the blurred figure in the photo, wide and wet, as though she had been staring for hours. Only when he pulled the picture from her grip did she blink and whisper, "It moved again." Daniel wanted to burn it. He even went so far as to strike a match and hold it near the glossy edge. But before the flame could touch it, the photograph curled in on itself and went dark, not from fire, but as though the image had been sucked into shadow. When he dropped it on the floor, the photo showed only a blank room now. No figure, no blur, just an empty shot of the study. That night, neither of them could bring themselves to sleep. They sat together on the couch, the house creaking all around them, until the clock ticked past 3 in the morning. That was when the sounds began. First came the tapping from the guest room, again measured, deliberate, like a metronome. Then the pacing in the upstairs hall. Then, unmistakably, the creak of the stairwell as something heavy descended step by step. They stared toward the dark outline of the foyer, hearts racing, waiting for a figure to emerge. But no one came. The steps stopped just shy of the bottom. Claire gripped Daniel's arm, nails digging into his skin, but he hardly felt it. His eyes were fixed on the front window. The reflection in the glass was wrong. It showed the two of them on the couch, yes, but behind them just faintly stood a tall shape, indistinct, head tilted, exactly as he had seen that night on the landing. Neither dared turn around. They sat frozen, the air around them pressing heavier with every second, as if the house itself leaned closer to listen. Then, as suddenly as it began, the weight lifted. The pacing stopped, the tapping ceased, and the house sank back into silence. In the morning, the Monroes didn't speak of it. They moved around each other quietly, both exhausted, both afraid that words would give the night permanence. But silence didn't protect them. When Claire stepped into the bathroom later that day, the mirror fogged over instantly, though no hot water had run. Across the misted surface, letters slowly formed, traced by an unseen hand. She backed away as the message revealed itself. Scene 2. The words on the mirror froze Claire in place. Her reflection wavered behind the letters, pale and trembling, as if the glass held a version of her already rehearsing fear. She whispered Daniel's name, but no sound left her lips. Her voice failed under the weight of that fogged command. Scene 2. Daniel rushed in at the sound of her body stumbling backward, and when he saw the message, his face drained of all color. He reached out, swiped his palm across the mirror, and the letters vanished but only from the glass. His hand came away damp, streaked with condensation that clung like ink, spelling the words still faintly against his skin. They did not leave the house. Perhaps they should have. Perhaps instinct should have carried them out into the street, anywhere but there. But the Monroes were already too entangled. Fear kept them from moving, and the house seemed to know it. That night, the whispers began before dusk. They weren't scattered voices now, they were lines, rehearsed and repeated, spoken in different tones, like multiple actors reciting the same script until it filled the air. Claire covered her ears, but the voices pressed through, resonating in her chest more than her head. Daniel tried to drown them with the television, but every channel flickered to static, and the static began to mouth the words back to them. At midnight, the tapping from the guest room door started again. Louder this time, insistent, as if whatever was inside had grown impatient. The tape Claire had pressed across the door days earlier curled and fell to the floor. Daniel stood frozen at the bottom of the hall, staring at the doorknob as it rattled once, twice, then turned slowly with an audible click. The door creaked open. No one stood there. The room was dark, the air inside unnaturally cold, carrying that same faint cigarette smell. But the shadows along the walls seemed too thick, almost liquid, pooling into the corners. Claire clutched Daniel's arm, begging him not to step forward, but he moved anyway, as if compelled. When he flicked the switch, the bulb sputtered and then flared to life. For a moment, the room looked ordinary, just a neglected guest room, dusty and bare. But the longer they looked, the more wrong it became. The walls were covered in faint impressions, as if hundreds of hands had pressed outward from inside the plaster, leaving behind warped bulges where the fingers had once reached. Claire gasped and stumbled back, but Daniel walked inside. The light above him flickered violently, casting the impressions in shifting shadows. And then, from the farthest corner, came the sound of breathing. Slow, ragged, deliberate. Claire screamed for him to leave, but the house swallowed her voice. Daniel turned toward the sound, and in that instant the door slammed shut between them. She clawed at the knob, pounding with her fists, her cries hoarse. On the other side she heard him shout her name. Once, twice, and then his voice was drowned out by a roar of overlapping whispers, lines tumbling over one another in a crescendo of madness. When she finally forced the door open, the room was empty. No Daniel, no furniture, no walls marked with pressed hands. It was bare, stripped clean, as though nothing had ever been there at all. Only the single light bulb swayed overhead, spinning lazily, its glow flickering across a floor that seemed newly painted, smooth and untouched. Claire stumbled back, choking on tears, calling his name through the halls. But the house answered first. The television downstairs snapped on by itself, static hissing. Slowly, shapes formed in the blur, and she saw him. Daniel, sitting on the couch, staring blankly forward, lips moving as if reading lines from a script she couldn't hear. Behind him, in the reflection of the darkened screen, other shapes loomed, figures without faces, standing like an audience watching the scene unfold. The screen went black. Claire collapsed to her knees, her voice breaking as she begged for the house to let him go. But there was no answer. Only the long, suffocating silence of walls that had been listening all along. When neighbors finally noticed the Monroes were gone, weeks later, the house stood quiet once again. Real estate agents came and went, doors opened and closed, but no one stayed long. And at night, when the wind curled through the canyon, locals swore they could hear faint voices carrying from the property rehearsed lines, spoken in whispers, waiting for someone else to step inside and continue the story. Wes Craven's house had not lost its director. It had simply found new actors. Would you spend a night here? Comment below. Which house should I do next?